Hello everyone and welcome to every episode of the Fairly Oddparents Season 6 Reviewed. Let's waste no time and just get right into the episodes. Episode 81 and 82, Fairly Odd Baby, Timmy Wishes for a Fairy Sibling. This and another episode this season are the last ones that I remember watching as they aired. My mom left the house that night and so I pretty much begged my dad to sit down and watch this one with me. But recalling that memory didn't really prepare me for what this episode would be. I hadn't seen this episode in probably at least a decade, so any strong feelings I had about this episode one way or another were pretty much gone. So after watching this episode, I have to say it begins pretty awfully. Cosmo and Wanda all of a sudden get into this baby obsession, causing Timmy to lose a parachute multiple times and fall from what would be lethal heights in real life. And for the first half of the episode, that really does set the tone. Until Poof is actually born, Cosmo is a huge jerk to Timmy, and it gets treated as Timmy's fault when the demands of Cosmo are absolutely worth his reaction. When you're the target of the game Pin the Tail on the Bucktooth Servant Boy, that builds up a lot of sympathy that we really never get a satisfying end to. So, yeah, the first half was pretty terrible, and as for the second half, it's essentially a game of hot potato, with all the main cast trying to grab the baby and use him for their own selfish ends. It wasn't very engaging, and the few jokes there aren't very funny. A lot of it is just randomness for the sake of randomness, or Timmy getting vomited on. I'd consider the first half to be bad, but the second half to be okay, so that means the average is right on the line between okay and bad. I went back and forth, but I decided to give this episode an okay, but it was very close to being bad, and one or two more bad moments could have changed my rating. Episode 83A, Mission Responsible. Timmy watches over Poof on Cosmo and Wanda's night out. So here it makes sense what they were trying to do. You introduce another character, it makes sense why the next episode would focus on that character. They kind of make it seem like this episode takes place right after the last one, while also trying to make it seem like some time has passed. So I'm not sure where this fits in chronologically, but it doesn't really matter that much. The actual meat of the episode is what I would describe as good, but flawed. I enjoyed the jokes in this episode, as small as they may be, because this episode tries to fit a lot of them one after another. I like the joke of the lion and how Timmy constantly keeps making things worse, stuff where the punchline is obvious but still amusing. Some jokes just didn't land at all though, like Cosmo hitting himself repeatedly, but overall, I liked more of the jokes than I didn't like. Now, what's disappointing about this one is that unlike most plots of this sort, Cosmo and Wanda never suspect anything. They're generally worried, but their demeanor doesn't really change from the beginning of the episode, and to me, if you're going to do anything like that, that's how you create tension in the episode. I feel like the writers thought there was enough tension with Timmy himself, but there's even a line in this very episode that shatters that line of thinking. Timmy tries to rescue Poof from the top of an unfinished building and then says, "Oh yeah, you can float," or something like that. And that's really the problem I have. Like, fairies are immortal, as has been established, so any tension can't come from fear of death, but rather from the outside. I know I gave this one a good, and I'm talking at length about the problem I had, but it is small. All you'd need to fix it is maybe one or two lines of dialogue, and I don't want the things I like to go unappreciated compared to that small issue I had. Episode 83B, Hurricane. Timmy's hair grows into a monster with a mind of its own. As stories go, this is a classic escalation story where Timmy wishes for something and it ends up being more powerful than anyone expected and starts terrorizing the city. I feel like I've seen this before on here, but I can't come up with any specific examples offhand. And I only bring that up because I don't really think this episode did anything new to make me enjoy it. The jokes were very vanilla and very standard Fairly Oddparents humor. Lots of "and then the opposite happens" jokes. And all the cuts back to Wanda and Rip Studwell were just boring and cut the other plot into pieces rather than standing alone on its own. I was actually going to give this a bad, but that was until the ending, when Timmy's dad actually saves the day, because, to be honest, that's a good moment. They could have easily just faded to black and said that everything goes back to the way it was, but Mr. Turner actually changes his ways at the end. And whether or not you want to take that as a joke, you have to admit that that's something we don't really see a lot on this show. So I think that takes this episode up to an okay. It was honestly really boring, and if you didn't like it, I can see why. It was kind of a struggle trying to find a highlight in the episode. It's just that devoid of things happening. Or at least, interesting things happening. Episode 84A, Open Wide and Say Ah. Timmy must get his tonsils removed, but Cosmo keeps getting too distracted to perform the surgery. You guys remember Poof. It seems so long ago when we talked about his first appearance on the show. But we're only at the 4th episode of the season, and it already seems as though they've stopped caring about giving him any kind of screen time. Outside of the first scene or two, he really doesn't do anything, and I mean, he's a baby. The things he even can do are kind of limited. But once you get beyond that, this is really still a hard one to sit through. Timmy goes through a lot in this episode, and it's one of those times where I question the decisions they made. Just like in Snowbound, Vicky has no reason to be in this episode. I mean, at least they put her in here to force a conflict, so it makes a little more sense than in that episode, but honestly, all she does is torment Timmy while Cosmo is as incompetent as possible. A lot of the things I think were supposed to be jokes were just really disturbing. Because unlike other episodes where Timmy gets tortured beyond belief, this time, he's a weak and hobbled hospital patient, which sends it to a whole nother level of being messed up. A lot of the jokes in this episode were at Timmy's expense, so, by default, the one that isn't has to be the highlight. Fairly Oddparents has already shown me that in this episode they have more characters than they know what to do with, so they just put them in random situations with no thought put in. I think the makers of this show really thought it would be funny to put Vicky in here for the sole purpose of torturing Timmy, but really, it's only funny if we see some kind of earlier scene that shows that she knew he was getting his tonsils removed. And after some more thought, I realize now how little sense this plot makes. It's a bad episode. Although it's not as bad as it could have been. They did try their best to salvage a pretty dumb concept, but it still turned out awfully. 84B, Oddparents. As Poof grants Timmy's wish to watch a baseball game, real pirates terrorize Dimsdale. I'm just gonna cut right to the chase on this one. This plot makes absolutely no sense. Let's start with the beginning where Wanda just lets Poof grant wishes. I guess it's good that they're finally remembering that they added this character to the cast, but the way it's executed here is just dumb. Wanda's obviously letting Timmy be put in harm's way and she just doesn't care because it's giving Poof an opportunity to learn how to grant wishes. And I'm sorry, but that's just really weak reasoning. And it's not something you should let happen repeatedly after it goes wrong the first time. This is your fault, Wanda, and don't forget that. If I was Timmy or Cosmo, I certainly wouldn't. And the ending complements the beginning of this episode by also being terrible. At the end, we find out that this pirate guy isn't speaking gibberish for no reason, but because he was choking on a chicken bone. And then we find out that he wanted to be a chef for some reason. Like, come on! As if the story already didn't make no sense. These guys who have been shown to be bad guys throughout the whole episode really weren't the bad guys. And this pirate captain goes on to make the parrot a scapegoat, I guess because they thought it would be funny. But no, it's not. And the one thing that could have redeemed that was if Poof saved the day. Instead, the baseball team does, so Poof never really grows as a character, and instead, these characters that we've never seen before and probably will never see again are the ones that save the day. It's a bad episode, and nothing really gets resolved from that whole sequence either. It's clearly established that these pirates are from the past, and they never go back to the past. The entire crew is stuck in the future, all to indulge their captain's dreams of becoming a chef, which he can do in the past anyway. Because yeah, if it wasn't confusing enough, adding time travel to your episode is a sure way of simplifying it, isn't it? Episode 85, The Fairly Odd Olympics. Fairies, pixies, and anti-fairies compete to determine who's the best magical creature. Usually when this show doubles the length of episodes, it makes sense why they do it, and they don't typically do it willy-nilly like that other show. But this is one of those times where I scratch my head because I can't for the life of me figure out why this needed to be a 22-minute episode. Because when that other show made a similar episode, it was 11 minutes long and didn't take itself too seriously. In this episode, they pulled the all too common tactic of pretending that there's some kind of actual stakes when there obviously aren't any stakes. Obviously the fairies are going to win, or at least there's going to be some kind of contrivance that's going to result in a happy ending. It really doesn't matter how much you think you can do with the plot. If you start writing the episode and have to constantly fill up the time, your episode's going to be boring, which is exactly what this episode was. I'm gonna give it an okay. I didn't care when I saw the Pixies and Anti-Fairies cheating, and I didn't care when Jorgen got knocked out, because if this show has taught me anything, it's that the writers will find their way out of any situation, and doubling the length of the episode doesn't fix that. Episode 86A, Odd Squad. Wanting to be like his favorite TV character, Timmy drives Cosmo as a car to solve the mystery of Mama Cosmo. This was a really refreshing episode to see. I don't feel like this is retreaded territory, and honestly, outside of the first episode this season, that hasn't been something I was able to say. I like that in this episode, the characters are just going around having fun and trying to solve a mystery, while also making subtle nods at various action show tropes. And they explain the fake show they've created just enough for it to connect in the viewer's brain and not feel foreign. I like the overall atmosphere of the episode, and I think it's just fun all the way through. If I have one complaint, it's that the ending just kind of happens with not a lot of satisfaction. The plot kind of slows down leading up to it, so they don't have as much time to wrap everything up at the end, and it kind of shows. I still do think it's a good episode though, and I'm glad to see that they're still coming up with fresh ideas 6 seasons in. And while some of the execution in the other episodes isn't as good as this one, they still haven't quite lost their touch at this point. Episode 86B, for emergencies only. Timmy gets his own wand that can grant 10 wishes, but he must use it for emergencies only. Once again, I have to give proper credit where it's due for the creativity in this concept. I'm not going to say things like it haven't been done before, but it certainly is a fresh take on concepts we've seen before. This is, hands down, the best story so far this season. I think it does sort of a take on the lesson, use the things you're given wisely, and I don't think it goes too overboard. It's subtle enough to where the personality of the show can still shine through a little bit. I will admit that the way the wish goes bad is a bit of a cop-out, like how those bodyguards that pop up join Francis' side over basically nothing. That didn't need to happen, or if you absolutely insisted on having that as a plot point, you have to put it before the main conflict of the episode. The idea also seems very natural though, and it's not forced like a lot of the ones in Season 6 so far. Timmy has a reason to complain, but so do Cosmo and Wanda, who have to take care of a baby and Timmy at the same time. It's natural that something would have to give. But all of it would be nothing if the ending wasn't as great as it was. The family photo gives a nice end to the story, and I'm gonna be honest, I got a little choked up as I was watching it. That's just how emotionally invested I was in the story. This is definitely a good episode. Episode 87A, Cheese and Crockers. Crocker gets a hold of Timmy's fairies after becoming a man-cheese hybrid. You know, it's always a treat when I come across an episode like this. This was one of my childhood favorites, and I was wondering if it would hold up. Sometimes, like in the case of the Jimmy Timmy Power Hour trilogy, the episodes just don't hold up as well as I remember them. This episode really does hold up, though. First off, as far as jokes go, you have a lot of Crocker's classic antics, which is nice to see, as this is really the first time they majorly showcased this season. There's a lot of cheese puns, which, as a connoisseur of puns myself, I have to appreciate. And I know it's not a joke, but there's kind of a weird circumstance that never has any attention drawn, that the fact that Crocker, a strange man, is parked in a van outside a 10-year-old boy's house and then breaks into his room. That's really strange, but it's also kind of funny just due to how weird it is and how oblivious Crocker is to the optics of that. And that's kind of it, as far as jokes go. Yeah, this episode is kind of light on jokes, but I do think there's enough there to be solid. And to me, what ties this together is the ending fight between Crocker and Timmy. That actually pushes this beyond a good into being one of those memorable episodes, not just from this season, but from the entire series. I really like the episode, and I can see it lining up with the classics. Episode 87B, Land Before Timmy. After being frustrated with technology too many times, Timmy wishes to go back to the Stone Age. Of all the things for Timmy to wish for, I never expected wishing for there to be no technology to even be on the table. And man, for an episode that wants to show how frustrated Timmy is with technology, they really seem to not know how technology works at all. It is fascinating how awful the setup to this episode is. Like, Timmy can't work a printer, but he can make an animated message pop up on screen like it's nothing, which isn't possible the way it's shown, and certainly wasn't back in 2008. Then Mr. Turner's GPS tells him to drive past their destination and into a tree. And not only that, but the GPS screen apparently shows what's in front of the car from a first-person perspective. Seems like if you want to do an episode covering the topic of technology, you'd actually know how to technology. So yeah, that's my first problem. And my second one is that this episode wants to deal with this topic while also spoofing the Flintstones, which I'd be fine with if they devote their focus to it. After all, the nods to the Flintstones are my favorite part of the episode, but they spend way too much time on the setup, which is executed poorly anyway, and they also spend too much time on the conflict resolution, so the jokes don't really get the screen time they need, which is unfortunate because this episode had the potential to be really funny. So yeah, it's a bad episode. Episode 88, Merry Wishmas. Through a charitable act, Timmy accidentally creates a new holiday that puts Santa Claus out of business. As Christmas specials go, this one is a lot less on the nose than others I've seen. Obviously there's Christmas every day from this show, but even in other shows I don't know that I've seen such a deconstruction of how we celebrate Christmas, and seen it done as well as it is here. First of all, the The jokes here are top notch. This is probably one of the funniest Season 6 episodes so far. I like how Santa Claus and the elves just move in with Timmy's family, and I like Mr. Turner as Nogman, a little callback to the first Christmas special. And I like Timmy's mom going on about a radio contest. I think there's a lot to like as far as jokes, and the best part of that is the jokes support the plot. In some episodes, the plot exists and the jokes are just there to supplement the plot on its own. But here they're intertwined, and it's very nice. I think it sort of has to work that way in a Christmas special. The idea of Timmy creating these coupons is a nice gesture, and for once, we get to see world building tied into the problem of the wish. The wish itself is what causes the conflict through other people's doing, not just Timmy's lack of thought, which supports the deconstruction we see. It's not just about Christmas, it's about a new holiday overshadowing Christmas, which I don't think I've seen anywhere. It's a good episode. Episode 89A, King Chang. Mark Chang becomes king of Yuccopotamia at the cost of Yuccopotamia itself and potentially Earth. Fun fact, when fairies shrink, so too does the potency of their magic, which that has to have been contradicted before. Actually, it's contradicted in every episode. Unless you want to tell me that when they turn into fish every episode, they don't have to be the fish that are the same size. You know what I mean. I'm not going to get on that tangent. But honestly, about the actual episode, it left a lot to be desired. Like a lot of this episode's problems, as you've already seen a preview of, are things outside of the episode itself, in the greater context of the show. Why does Vicky not know who Mark Chang is? Like, he acknowledges her, but once his disguise is broken, she acts like she's never seen him before. Isn't he supposed to be like some guy from Europe to her? She should have recognized him. And then there's the fact of Mark's parents being okay with him staying on Earth. In most of his other appearances, his parents would have had a problem, but they take little to no convincing in this episode, and it's not exactly clear why. Overall, there's just too many questions in this story and not enough answers. It's an okay episode. Episode 89B, The End of the University. Being persuaded by Dark Laser to become evil, Cosmo and Wanda must convince Timmy that fairy magic is better by comparison. This episode I have some problems with, like right off the bat. This episode has many of the same problems as El Tigre, where it's a struggle between good and bad, but the bad side is extremely enticing. And it seems that there's no reason for the character to ever pick good. There is no reason for Timmy to not join Dark Laser, and they do a horrible job at conveying it anyway. And Cosmo in his stupidity tries to make the problem even worse. Like, obviously I get that that's supposed to be the joke, but if your joke is to point out the problem with your own story, it kinda backfires. That doesn't mean there weren't any funny jokes in here. I mean, Dark Laser giving a tour of whatever he calls this version of the Death Star to Timmy's parents was pretty funny, but that doesn't redeem this enough. It's an okay episode. I wanted to give this one the benefit of the doubt so bad, but it doesn't do many favors for itself. And I think with a little tweaking, this episode could have been better. Also, really quickly, I want to address this. Some people might think of this as a ripoff of Negatimmy from the last season, but the story goes in a different direction, and obviously due to the rating, I think this episode is better. Episode 90A, Super Poof. Timmy's parents discover Poof and practically adopt him as their own, meaning Timmy must get them to willingly give him up. This episode rubbed me the wrong way. Like, I'm talking about in a way that It's a Wishful Life only dreams of doing. In this episode, Timmy's parents don't give a crap about him. So what? That happens in most episodes. In this one, it's a lot bigger of a problem than it would be because of the fact that it's crucial to the structure of the story instead of being played for laughs. Timmy's parents in this episode are so oblivious, they're willing to take in some baby they've never seen before and blatantly show love toward it, and show how much they obviously love this baby that isn't theirs more than their own child. And don't say they make up for it at the end of the episode, because it's a complete 180-degree pivot that comes completely out of nowhere. If they maybe foreshadowed it at basically any point in the episode, maybe there'd be something there, but it honestly seems more believable that they have multiple personality disorder than it is that they'd go from not giving a crap about their son to all of a sudden loving their son when we've seen no evidence that they actually do. If you want to make jokes about Timmy's parents not caring about him, then do that! But don't completely ruin the joke and use that as your conflict resolution. Because at that point, it's not a conflict resolution. This is obviously a bad episode. And it is by far the worst one since It's a Wishful Life. Episode 90B, Wishing Well. Jorgen sends Timmy to a rehab facility to stop him from overwishing. So far this season, this is the episode that I've had the toughest time trying to parse as far as what rating I want to give it. On one hand, this episode seems like a huge missed opportunity. This is the perfect story to put Remy in, but for some reason they decided to give us two new one-dimensional characters that we never see again instead. But I do like the jokes in this episode. Jorgen's nonchalant, I'm cruel but I don't care attitude is pretty funny, as well as the running gag with the fruitcake. But what I like the most is the adventure these characters go on. Timmy's intuitiveness is a trait that we've seen in certain instances, but I don't think we've ever seen it fleshed out to this extent. You know, as I'm talking through it, I'm talking myself more and more into giving this a good. It's a light good episode to be sure, but I do think the new setting, exploration of Jorgen in his own episode, and the jokes within are enough to bump up the rating, and outweigh a less than stellar cast of characters in this episode. Outside of that, there's not really a lot to talk about with this one. Episode 91A, Wishy-Washy. Timmy wishes for a car wash that makes things new again, but unfortunately, it literally ends up happening to Cosmo and Wanda. Here we have an episode that just falls flat on its face. I understand what they were trying to go for, though. You bring back the Striker Z, recontextualize it, and shift the focus to Cosmo and Wanda. I mean, the Striker Z is really only important for like the first and last minute of the episode, though. And the meat of the episode is Timmy trying to reverse Cosmo and Wanda's age shift. Of course, I say that like there even is any meat to this episode. Yeah, there's a lot of filler here, and I don't think that much of the plot structure makes sense. Like, a lot of what happens is just Timmy sitting in his driveway while Mr. Turner tries to repair his failing marriage. Which, speaking of that subplot, I found it to be a complete waste of time. Like, Mr. Turner loves his car more than Mrs. Turner, but then he gives her a ring and now she loves it more than Mr. Turner. Seriously, nothing was accomplished by that. Are there at least any good jokes? Well, do you like misunderstood slang that no one from any era ever used? Good, then you're in luck. For the rest of us, this was a very boring episode. In fact, and this is a rare move for me, I was so bored by this that, yeah, I'm gonna call it bad. I really wish I could get that 11 minutes back. Episode 91B, Poof's Playdate. To assuage Wanda's fears of Poof not socializing enough, Timmy wishes for other fairies to become babies. My favorite part of this was the two adult jokes they throw in seemingly out of nowhere. That's not something the Fairly Oddparents does very often, but these were two genuinely funny jokes on the level of Family Guy in terms of the adultness scale. There's the quote on this slide, which is obviously a hint at Cupid being gay, and then there's the masturbation joke, which has been memed to the ends of the earth. But onto this episode, obviously my first note is that I think that's a really funny episode. Like, there's the running gag they brought back from Information Superhighway where Mr. Turner uses a battering ram, and just the frenetic pace at which these fairy babies find their way all over the house. I'll admit that the story itself is kind of stale, though. Clearly this episode was inspired by Babyface and even the previous episode. Seriously, the previous episode was about Cosmo and Wanda becoming younger and not being able to get themselves back to normal. As much of an oversight as it was, I'm going to defend it by the fact that they're two clearly different age groups. But yeah, that certainly isn't something that would fly if this episode wasn't as funny as it was. I think it's a good episode, and I was pleasantly surprised because going in I actually expected this to be a train wreck, due to babies not really being able to do much of anything. But it actually works mainly because the focus is more about Timmy's parents. And if you're wondering how to make them stupid the correct way, this is how. Don't do what you did in Super Poof. Episode 92A, Vicky Gets Fired. Vicky gets fired, so in search of a new job, she becomes mayor of Dimsdale. Wow. I am speechless. I really thought Wishy-Washy was terrible, but this episode gives it some stiff competition. Seriously, let's start with the small problem with the episode, and I can't even believe I'm calling this the small problem because it's an oversight that should have gotten the episode shelved at the concept stage. So there's this reality TV contest Timmy's parents try to enter, so they set up cameras around the house and try to record everything. Wanda suggests that Timmy should show his parents the footage of all the awful things Vicky does to him. Wanda says this while standing in front of the camera. Timmy's parents will see Cosmo and Wanda if he shows them this footage. Like, come on, you had to know that would cause some kind of problem. The catalyst for why the episode is even happening is a plot hole. I can't believe it. Well, actually, what's even less believable is that this is the least of the problems in the episode. Timmy's parents go back to not caring about him when they watch the footage, as the only thing they care about is that Vicky taped over the episodes and not all the deranged things he goes through. In that regard, they took one step forward and two steps back. And then the conflict of the episode is that there's not a single job Vicky can have that doesn't result in her ruling over Earth as some kind of deranged dictator. So the conflict resolution is that Timmy is basically forced to suck it up and keep taking this abuse. You don't have to talk about how terrible that is, right?
It's a bad episode.
Poorly conceived, and from start to finish there were loads of problems. You know the Gumball episode, The Job? Yeah, well, this is that episode if it were terrible. Episode 92B, Kindred Spirits. Due to the Crimson Chin's bout of depression, Timmy wishes up a lover for him. Say it with me. The rules state that you can't use magic to interfere with true love. You good with that? Because to me it seems that it was a massive oversight on the part of the writers of this episode. They were definitely aware of that rule, but they applied it in the most tangential way possible. Timmy can use it to completely change a person's identity even if someone's in love with them, but if that person is in love with their own self, they can't change back? What even is the logic behind that? I thought the whole point of the rules was to limit magic so characters can't just do whatever they want, while still being simple enough that the average viewer could understand. But they overthought this way too much, to the point that there's not really a way I could see this working. Now, why am I not angry like I was in the last review? Well, I enjoyed other aspects of this episode. I think Depressed Chin is hilarious, and I think Cross-Dressing Kneecap is hilarious. I was able to find a lot of the jokes here to be really funny, and that goes a long way in bumping up a subpar story. So in lieu of being a bad story, this episode as a whole is okay. Episode 93A, 9 Lives. Timmy tries to find a new job for Adam West. I think at some point I've become numb at this show's attempts to shock me, and it seems Catman episodes have the ability to do that. Maybe there's just room for one superhero on this show. I mean, this is right after a Crimson Chin episode, and that's one thing I never understood. Catman is a man that acts like a cat, and of course Adam West does his whole Adam West thing. But if you remove the mask, it's just Adam West's character from Family Guy in a cat costume. And putting him in the SpongeBob episode Stanley S. SquarePants doesn't make his shtick any more funny. I said I wouldn't hold other shows' episodes against this one, and I know I've already mentioned 2 other shows in this very review, but I think it speaks to the fact that this character's shtick really isn't that funny to me. And so comparing it to other things I've seen is my only way of relating to it. So far this character has appeared in 2 okay episodes and 1 good episode. So clearly there was something there at one point, but it's so frustrating how they don't use the potential they have with this character. The Crimson Chin's episodes are full of life. This character gives me nothing to say. It's just lame all around. It's not necessarily bad, but I have a hard time getting excited in one direction or the other. It's just okay. Episode 93B, Dread and Breakfast. Timmy's parents open up a bed and breakfast in their house whose first guests are Timmy's enemies. I always thought of an episode of Timmy's worst enemies together against him would be a good concept. I don't really know how this episode eluded me throughout my childhood because it just makes perfect sense for the show. Crocker's been relatively quiet this season, and that's been sad for me to see because he's one of my favorite characters in the show. Dark Laser appears in this episode, which I'm fine with. He seems to be popping up more and more for some reason. And then there's Tootie, which is really the only problem I have with this episode. Like, there's already been an episode where that family stays in the Turner's house, and for Tootie to only be there by herself, I don't know, it doesn't make sense for her to be here. And I've let it be known anyway that she's not one of my favorite characters in this show. So I guess, yeah, it's an alright group of antagonists for me, but if that were only it, this episode would have probably gotten an okay. But what makes the episode for me is Mr. Turner's sock monkeys. There's a right way and a wrong way to do this kind of stupid humor, as I've shown. This is the right way, and a nice bonus is that it's used as a conflict resolution and kind of ties everything together. As it's brought up that they don't fight or do anything, and the conflict is solved by using them to fight, so yeah, it's good. Episode 94A, Birthday Bashed. On Timmy's birthday, Jorgen threatens to take Cosmo and Wanda away. I've mentioned before that story isn't usually the end-all be-all when it comes to an episode's rating. Sometimes an episode can be funny enough that it's a lot easier to forgive the storytelling flaws within. This is one of those times. I think it's pretty weak that on one of Timmy's birthdays that doesn't look that old, he's supposed to lose Cosmo and Wanda. Channel Chasers already proved that Timmy was going to keep Cosmo and Wanda for at least a few more years. But on what's presumably Timmy's 11th birthday, he's at threat of losing them. I know this show doesn't keep super great continuity, but what doesn't change from episode to episode is the rules, and so I have a hard time believing the story in the first place. But with that said, I also think most of the jokes here are pretty good. The highlight is a pretty funny one, and it's also used in part of the story as a plot point. And I also like the video Jorgen shows Timmy at the beginning of the episode. And, once again, for every time the jokes revolving around Timmy's parents are done badly, there's an episode where they get it. This is one of the times where they get it. Where it looks like this is the one time Timmy's parents remember his birthday, nope, they're celebrating their anniversary. Which is pretty clever. So I'm gonna give this one a light good. Episode 94B, Momnipresent. Timmy tries to evade his mom's boring to-do list to prepare for Septemberfest. This episode was actually a pleasant surprise. I was expecting this episode to be as boring as the synopsis suggests it is, but I was surprisingly able to stay engaged because this is one of the funniest episodes of Season 6. The highlight is really just the tip of the iceberg. There's also Mr. Turner's obliviousness at the fact that he's with a fake Timmy robot, and there's the ending which packs joke after joke after joke into a small space, with a satisfying end to boot. My favorite of those being Poof vomiting on Mr. Turner's ham. But as for story, I think they could have easily gone the route of trying to place Timmy in the wrong for not wanting to spend time with his mom, which would have made this a lot worse, as Timmy does have a valid excuse to not want to do that. So I'm glad they went with the compromise, which usually doesn't happen in this show. I also like that this is a very fast-paced and action-filled episode. Unfortunately, those episodes were kind of lacking in this season compared to others, so I think that should be appreciated. So overall, I think this episode is good. Glad to see something this unique this late in the series. Episode 95 to 100, Wishology. Timmy is revealed to be the Chosen One, the only person who can stop an entity known as the Darkness. Wow, this is a big episode. Clocking in at about 2 hours and 15 minutes, this episode is a long one. Or should I say episodes? It's technically divided into 3 45-minute segments, so does it even count as one episode? Well, here's what I've decided to do. Since no matter what, people are going to be angry at what I decide to do, I'm going to review them all separately and give the whole trilogy one rating at the end, since functionally I think it's best rated as one episode. So, in the first part we get a lot of exposition before the action really starts to happen, but we do get a glimpse of what is to come. I think too much stock was placed into Timmy being the Chosen One at this point for viewers to not already side with him continuing that role, because Turbo Thunder is introduced rather late. Keep in mind that to viewers, it looks like a conflict has already been solved, though there is a bit of foreshadowing at the end. Because we've already seen Timmy do much of the legwork in solving the mini conflict we see in this part, Turbo Thunder doesn't seem to have much weight from a viewer perspective. I will admit that just going in, I was skeptical of them being able to fill up 45 minutes, let alone do it 3 times. But it actually does seem to be one continuous plot all the way through, with a good amount of jokes sprinkled in. And there's even an Abracatastrophe reference in here, which is just top tier considering how fast and loose continuity has been in Season 6. And I also have to give them props for giving Timmy no easy way out of this. Cosmo and Wanda don't find him until about 2/3 of the way through, and they also don't have their wands. That's especially challenging to make engaging, but often what you'll find is that better stories come with more limitations. Maybe my only gripe with this first part is that in the beginning, when Jorgen makes everyone forget who Timmy is, he doesn't tell Timmy himself that he's not supposed to say his own name, thus making it more likely that he'll try to jog people's memory by saying his name. That wasn't very well thought out, but it sets up the rest of the story, so I can sorta give it a pass. Part 2 is probably the slowest of the 3. Most of the action in the second part happens toward the end of it, and that ending shows exactly why I've decided to give everything one single rating. It ends on a cliffhanger, so if I were to give it its own rating, would that really count against it? Well, honestly I think the build up to part 3 is pretty major, and that makes the second part suffer a little bit. Certain scenes are dragged out in part 2 that don't really need to be. Maybe I shouldn't have expected much in this aspect, but I honestly thought there really shouldn't be any reason for no questions to be answered here. After the first part, you'd expect the second part to kind of be its own self-contained conflict. But as we clearly see, 2 and 3 are kind of their own plot separate from, but branching off the first. So yeah, for sure part 2 is the weakest of the 3. As far as the third one goes, I think it's possibly the best way they could have concluded the trilogy. Maybe solving the plot by creating a smiley face out of the solar system was a bit cheesy, but I don't really have any complaints about it. Having Turbo Thunder be a little more fleshed out here was also a nice thing to see, and it's something I didn't expect to see. And I really do believe the slower second part was certainly worth it to get to where the episode ended. And that final gag with Cosmo in the cave was just great. Maybe if I had one gripe, it would be that Timmy was just allowed to wish for more ice wands. Like, if they're so sacred, why would it even be possible to create 8 more out of thin air? And the fact that it's treated as the obvious solution by the episode did leave me scratching my head. But other than that, I think the 3 together combined to make one good episode. And forget Channel Chasers, if you were going to end the show, this would be the place to do it, but obviously there are 4 more seasons left to go. And that is every episode of Season 6 reviewed. Let's look at the charts. If you can get past the charts getting harder and harder to fit on the screen at once, you'll notice that Season 6 is very similar to Season 2. In a more direct comparison, you'll see that the numbers actually add up to the same number of episodes, with Season 6 only having one more good episode and one fewer okay episode than Season 2. And, be as it may, that long string of good episodes at the end of Season 6 really couldn't stop it from being an okay season. There was just too much that I couldn't ignore with this season, and I think it is on par with Season 2. Maybe having better good episodes than that season, and maybe having worse bad episodes than that season. But, yeah, that about wraps it up for me. As always, thanks for watching. Top and Bottom 5 will be out soon.